I'll leave the kid for you to take care. As I wondered what he meant, Thomas uttered something unbelievable. Apparently, he was taking advantage of our current separation to live with his affair partner. He wanted to divorce me, right after my mother passed away, to marry his mistress. I had heard that separation is often treated like divorce, making it hard to claim compensation for infidelity after separating. Not caring anymore, I hung up the phone. 3 days later, I had 23 missed calls from Thomas on my mobile phone. But I thought his actions were despicable and didn't respond, just blocked his number. However, Thomas was persistent. He even sent texts through social media, which he normally never uses. That's when I decided to fight back against Thomas. Fine, if that's how you want it, I'll show you hell. Thomas, who didn't even attend my mother's funeral and was planning an elopement with his mistress, didn't deserve any sympathy. I was determined to pay him back double for everything he had done to us. My name is Sandra, a 46-year-old part-time worker and a housewife. My family consists of my husband Thomas, a year older than me, and our 16-year-old daughter in high school, Margaret. We lived in a small apartment in the countryside. I got married when I was 23, but after discovering I was infertile, it took 5 years of fertility treatments to finally have our long-awaited daughter. But after Margaret was born, I struggled with first-time parenting. Gradually, I lost my peace of mind and left the company I worked for, temporarily becoming a full-time housewife. In our society, whenever Margaret got sick, her mother, was called to accompany her to the hospital. This was what led me to quit my job. It wasn't that I hated caring for Margaret, but my boss indirectly suggested I resign, and I couldn't bear it and ran away. Eventually, staying at home all the time seemed depressing, so I put Margaret in daycare and started earning a bit as a part-time worker. Both Thomas and I couldn't forget the hardship of 5 years of fertility treatment, and we eventually settled on having just Margaret. I first noticed something was off with Thomas when Margaret was in upper elementary school. Margaret was academically gifted, so I really wanted her to try for private middle school. Margaret was positive about the idea of middle school entrance exams, and we even attended open campus events together to choose the best school. Thomas earned enough for us to live comfortably, even with me as a housewife. Plus, I was prepared to use my savings from before marriage or untouched part-time earnings for Margaret's education funds. But Thomas was adamantly against it. No. He was unyielding in his refusal to let Margaret take the exams. What's the point of a middle school entrance exam? Let her go to a regular middle school, that's enough for Margaret. Isn't the entrance exam something for daughters of company presidents or something? No matter how I tried to convince him, Thomas stubbornly refused. Finally, losing patience, I told Margaret, "You can take the exam if you want. I want to support what you want to do. Just focus on your studies without any worries." But Margaret just shook her head, looking sorry. She probably hated seeing us argue over her future. That's when I realized it. I shouldn't be showing this side of us to our child. I started to be extra careful not to get into intense arguments with Thomas for Margaret's sake. That marked the beginning of a life walking on eggshells around Thomas. But the more I tried to be careful, the more sensitive I became, and even trivial things would turn into arguments. Hey, I've been meaning to say this for a while. Isn't this stew too salty? I've always hated this kind of seasoning. Thomas suddenly confessed that he never liked my cooking. After our argument about the entrance exam, it seemed like he no longer held back. He started criticizing without care. For example, he started saying he didn't like Worcestershire sauce or that he always hated the tomatoes in his sandwiches. He kept going on about it at the dinner table, making me feel quite bad. So, reluctantly, I stopped adding tomatoes, which I used to make the dishes look good, and carrots, which he also said he didn't like. I don't want your lunch anymore. It doesn't look good and I lose my appetite. I responded to his requests, but to that he threw away the lunch I made. Fed up with his constant complaints, I finally exploded in anger. Then eat out. If you're going to complain that much, I won't make your sandwiches ever again. And from that point on, I stopped making sandwiches for Thomas altogether. A turning point came sometime later. It was when Margaret, who was attending a public middle school, was about to face high school entrance exams. Despite attending public school, she participated in an archery club outside of school and achieved a national competition placement. Margaret was also academically successful and skilled at piano, a hobby I had introduced to her. She always looked forward to her weekly lessons. She was an all-rounder, diligent, and even serving as the vice president of the student council. Although I had reluctantly made her give up on middle school entrance exams, I hoped this time she could attend the high school of her choice. When I asked about her preferred high school, she named a renowned private school within the state. I wasn't sure if I should say it, but I really want to go here. It's a prestigious school for archery, and I'll work hard for it. I nodded emphatically at Margaret's words. Margaret had started to accommodate her father Thomas, always putting herself last. She would decline offers to buy books or clothes she wanted. It's okay. Even when I gave her these as birthday gifts, she looked apologetic. Seeing my child like this filled me, as a mother, with a sense of helplessness. That's why I wanted to make her bravely spoken dream a reality. I reassured her that we could afford it with my savings and education insurance. However, when I informed Thomas about Margaret's educational aspirations, predictably, he flatly refused. No way. Attending a private high school in the state means she can't commute from here. So, she'll need a dorm or an apartment, right? I won't allow it, it's a waste of money. His words infuriated me. Calling the education expenses for our only daughter a waste? I couldn't hold back. You opposed to her middle school exams too. Why do you always say such things? Doesn't she deserve to live her life the way she wants? But my words seemed to have no effect on Thomas. He sighed theatrically and exclaimed, "No, private school and living alone as a high school student are a waste of money. If she doesn't go to a local public high school, I won't support you guys financially anymore." At that moment, I snapped. Fine, have it your way. But don't complain about whatever we decide to do. I'll figure it out, so you go ahead and apply to the high school you want. There's no need for you to compromise this time. Okay? Do as you wish. I encouraged Margaret again, but she looked worried. But she hesitated. Even so, I repeatedly reassured her. It's okay. And it seemed that Margaret had made up her mind. The following spring, Margaret successfully got into her first choice high school. Mom, I did it! Margaret returned from school with a beaming smile and shared the news. There's no parent who wouldn't be overjoyed at their child's successful high school entrance. I made a red velvet cake and praised her like crazy. Although there were tough times, she had done well. However, Thomas, not celebrating this achievement, said something awful. As promised, you take care of Margaret and yourself from now on. I won't contribute to the household expenses anymore. And just like that, he coldly stated his decision and stopped providing for the household expenses. Margaret would be moving into the high school dormitory soon. For me, knowing that my parenting phase was somewhat coming to an end and having already decided to work as a regular employee at a hospital where an acquaintance worked, I didn't think I would struggle financially. Therefore, Thomas's words and actions didn't bother me anymore. Months had passed since Margaret started high school. She had adapted to her new life, and I was relieved to hear that. I was working part-time, similar to full-time hours, at a hospital where an acquaintance worked, with an expectation of being made a full-time employee soon. I thought we wouldn't struggle financially. Thus, Thomas's words and actions didn't bother me anymore. Although Thomas and I hadn't divorced yet, we had been living separately for months after he moved out to a different apartment. I was busy with my new life, but realizing I could live without Thomas, I planned to divorce him as soon as everything was ready. I assumed Thomas wouldn't want to continue this separation forever either. Believing this separation would end one way or another, I went to the city office to get divorce papers. But then, I received devastating news. My mom back home had passed away. When I got the call from my dad, I was so shocked that I collapsed. Mom had always been frail, in and out of hospitals since I was young. I remembered praying with Dad for her successful surgeries. I knew she had been battling cancer for a year now and understood that her time was limited. Still, the news of her passing was hard to accept. Dad, having lost his lifelong partner, looked utterly defeated and downcast. He clearly lacked the strength to act as the representative of the family at the funeral. So, I stepped up to take on that role. Being an only child, there was no one else who could do it. Dad weakly smiled at my offer. "That would be a great help," he said in a faint voice. We hadn't told anyone about our separation, not even Dad or our acquaintances. So, I thought it best to invite Thomas to the funeral. I quickly sent him a text with details about Mom's passing and the funeral arrangements. As expected, there was no reply. On the day of the funeral, Thomas didn't show up, and Margaret, who had come home for the occasion, muttered, "He's the worst." Even Dad, who looked so frail, was angry, feeling insulted for his wife and daughter. I had my own grievances against Thomas, but now wasn't the time for that. "Both of you, I feel the same way. But do you want to send her off with angry faces? Mom always said, nothing can beat a smile, didn't she?" My words reminded Dad and Margaret of Mom's cheerful nature. We managed to regain our composure and give Mom a proper send-off. That night, Thomas finally called back, but with an insensitive remark. "I'll leave the kid for you to take care." In such a situation, what was he thinking? As I silently pondered, Thomas, unasked, began to talk volubly. "Let me put it simple. I'm planning to elope with my girlfriend. She's younger and cuter than you." Apparently, he was living with his mistress, using our separation to his advantage, and wanted to divorce me right after my mom's death so he could marry her. I've heard separation is often treated like divorce, making it hard to claim alimony for infidelity afterwards. But for me, such things didn't matter anymore. "Oh, really? Do as you please," I replied and hung up the phone. 3 days later, I had 23 missed calls from Thomas on my mobile phone. Thinking how despicable he was, I didn't respond and blocked his number. When he realized I wasn't going to answer the phone, he started sending apologies through social media. That's when I decided to fight back against Thomas. "Fine, if that's how you want it, I'll show you hell." Thomas had declared abandoning me and Margaret at the time of my mother's funeral, and on top of that, he was planning an elopement with his mistress. Mercy was unnecessary for someone like him who had mistreated us. I decided to pay him back double for everything he had done. I immediately texted to Thomas. "Let's meet tomorrow." The next day, I waited for Thomas at the cafe where we had agreed to meet. A few minutes later, Thomas arrived in a hurry, his face pale and clearly agitated. I had nothing to say to him. So, I just silently, or perhaps glaringly, stared at him. Thomas, unnerved by my uncharacteristically explicit attitude, slowly began to speak. "I truly regret not being able to attend your mom's funeral. But there's a reason. I'm a bit shaken, you know, it was just bad timing." Curious, I listened to his explanation. Apparently, one of Thomas's relatives had collapsed and was in critical condition, needing surgery to have a chance of survival. "So what? If surgery is the only option, then just do it. What does that have to do with anything else?" Thomas's face twisted in anguish as he replied. "It's a complex surgical procedure that can't be done in a normal hospital. So, it's going to be expensive, and insurance won't cover it." According to Thomas, it was an advanced medical operation that had to be paid entirely out of pocket. His family decided to pool money, and Thomas had to contribute around $10,000. I was astounded. How could he so easily spin such lies? "It's not Betty or Richard, it's some relative I've never even met, right?" When I coldly responded, Thomas turned red with anger. "Don't be so cold. You, who just lost your mother, should understand my feelings." I understood, but it was an entirely different issue. First of all, the timing of your relative's illness right after my mother's death is suspicious. And is it really a disease that requires advanced medical treatment? What's the diagnosis? How much will the surgery cost in total? As I pressed him with my thoughts, Thomas stumbled over his words and fell silent. My family, being well-known local landowners, had savings close to $1 million, which I was aware of. Even though Thomas might not know the details, he knew my family was wealthy, so I suspected he was after the inheritance. Given his past behavior, I couldn't trust him, even if he genuinely needed a significant amount of money for a medical issue. I sighed exaggeratedly and then continued. What you and I need to discuss are divorce, custody, and division of assets. That's all. But then Thomas pleaded. Wait. I'll never do anything to make you sad again. Reconsider, please. His face was contorted, clearly desperate to change the situation. I spoke again, more firmly. I can't have any hope for a future with you anymore. If you feel sorry, please proceed with the divorce. Saying that, I stood up, paid only for my coffee, and left. That night, Thomas unexpectedly showed up at our house. Hey, I know you're in there, open the door. When Thomas left to start our separation, he said he'd never return and left the keys, so naturally, he couldn't get in. However, at that moment, I was in the bathroom and didn't notice Thomas's arrival. It appeared that Margaret had responded instead, and when I noticed something was amiss and went to the front door, I saw the two of them. Margaret was home for the summer holidays, and had been staying with us since the funeral. What I saw was Thomas deeply apologizing and Margaret standing tall, looking down on him. What's going on? Thomas, what are you doing here? Thomas looked up, begging for forgiveness. Please, I'm begging you. Can you just lend me $10,000 as an advance on the property division? I thought he had come to apologize, but he was still asking for money. It became clear that Thomas didn't care about me or Margaret. Frustrated, I almost let my anger take over but managed to hold back. I wanted to yell and drive him away, but I knew running away wasn't an option anymore. For Margaret's sake, this separation needed to be resolved quickly. After taking a deep breath to calm myself, I said to Thomas, "That's irrelevant now. I already told you I wouldn't help you out with that. We handled my mother's funeral with my relatives, and you were not involved. Therefore, I don't see any need to care for a relative of yours I've never met." Thomas seemed to lose his words in response, as if he had nothing to say back. Thomas had always been hands-off with my family matters, whether it was hospitalization or funerals. Yet, now that he was in a bind, he wanted my help, which was far too convenient. Realizing that nothing he said would change my mind, Thomas turned to Margaret. Margaret, you tell Mom too. To you, a relative of your father is family too, right? Come on, please. You're kind-hearted, you'd feel bad knowing a family member is sick, right? Typically quiet, and when he did speak it was usually sarcastic, but in such moments, Thomas became talkative. And now, he was clinging to the daughter he tried to abandon for his mistress, having not even paid for her high school. I felt a headache coming on. I endured a lot for Margaret's sake, but maybe it would have been better to have divorced from the start and lived just the two of us. But it was too late for regrets now. I wondered what Margaret was thinking. Maybe she'd be moved by her father's words and try to persuade me. But as embarrassing as it was for me to have even considered that for a moment, Margaret responded with a resolute expression. Who are you? Both Thomas and I were stunned by her response. It wasn't rejection or comfort, but a denial of his very existence. Watching Margaret's composed face, I felt relieved. Impressed by the strength of my grown-up daughter, Margaret continued without looking at Thomas. You said you're leaving the kid to Mom, right? So, you've essentially abandoned your parental rights. You're divorcing Mom and going with your mistress, aren't you? It seemed Margaret had overheard my phone conversation with Thomas. I thought I had been discreet, but she must have had her own thoughts about her father not attending the funeral. To her, a man who was separated and unfaithful saying he didn't need her, was nothing more than a stranger. She declared him an outsider. That left Thomas utterly devastated, frozen in place. Margaret sighed deeply and glared at him. "After all the obstacles you've put in my path, don't try to act like a father now. To me, the only parent is Mom. I don't care about someone who didn't even show up for my beloved grandmother's funeral." Thomas stayed motionless for a while, but gradually seemed to grasp Margaret's words. Rising up with a furious look, he stared at Margaret. "You ungrateful child! Do you know how much I've sacrificed for you? If you're going to say that, then pay back all the school fees I've paid up till middle school." How childish was he? Who demands repayment for raising their own child? It made me nauseous to think he was my husband. Thomas, about to say something more, stepped closer to us. Margaret, sensing fear, stepped back. But just then, we heard the siren of a police car and saw it stop in front of the apartment. Thomas halted his advance and slowly turned around. Outside, the people I faced were our neighbors, their expressions even more daunting than Thomas's. Caught up in the commotion with Thomas, I hadn't realized I left the front door open. The walls of the apartment are thin, and many people were home during the evening hours. A neighbor, having heard the ruckus, apparently called the police. When Thomas realized the police were there for him, he became visibly flustered, losing all his previous bravado. The officers stepped out of the patrol car and came straight to us to inquire about the situation. Our neighbors had reported Thomas as a suspicious person. I've always had a good relationship with my neighbors. And when I mentioned my mother's funeral, they even said, "Please let us pay our respects." So they attended, and noticing that Thomas was absent, I had candidly explained. Remembering how they had unanimously condemned Thomas's absence and behavior recently, it was no surprise they called the police when they heard him causing a scene. Thomas always said neighborhood relations were unnecessary, but in that moment, I was grateful for our close-knit community. And the police didn't irresponsibly leave the scene unresolved. Thomas desperately tried to clear up the misunderstanding. "I'm the head of this household. What's wrong with a husband returning to his wife and daughter's home? This is just a little family disagreement, nothing that needs to trouble the police." That's what he was pleading. His earnest plea only sparked a chorus of boos from onlookers. The officer calmed the crowd and then asked me if Thomas's claims were true. I answered honestly. "I'm embarrassed to say, but we are currently separated. My husband already has someone else, and we were ready for divorce. I've even prepared the divorce papers." The officer believed my story and instructed Thomas to return to his current residence. The neighbors, who had been watching from a distance, emanated an aura of "go back home already." Thomas still seemed eager to argue, but I told him, "This won't solve anything. Besides, when we separated, this house was transferred to my name, and I've been paying the rent. Don't just barge in." He had no reply to that. Margaret then chimed in, echoing my sentiment. "Officer, I'm scared of this man." That seemed to be the final straw. The police, recognizing the need to protect Margaret, a minor, firmly told Thomas, "Dad, it's time to go home." Facing the backlash, Thomas realized his efforts were futile and dejectedly left. 2 weeks have passed since Thomas's visit. I consulted a lawyer about the incident and decided to proceed with the divorce, seeking their assistance. Given Thomas's behavior, a straightforward discussion seemed unlikely. The lawyer agreed, confirming my decision was right. Finally, the day came to speak with Thomas again. He appeared dejected, but I unceremoniously handed him the documents without a word. Thomas browsed through them, puzzled at first, but his expression turned to one of shock. "Wait, what is this? How did you find this out?" The document detailed a compensation claim against Thomas and his mistress. All of Thomas's previous behavior was a facade. While it was true he had an affair, the woman had instigated him to play a part. "If the mother-in-law had passed away, Sandra will inherit something, right? Just shake her up a bit, and she'll probably want to settle with money. It'll be easier for us to get married." how about getting around $10,000? The story about needing money for advanced medical treatment for a sick family member was a lie. It was a fictional scenario created to swindle money from me. I had felt uneasy about the whole situation. After the funeral, Thomas had called nonchalantly, ready to break up, but then suddenly turned desperate by dawn. I suspected there was more to it. The timing was too convenient. Trusting my intuition, right after Thomas's call, I secretly hired a private investigator to conduct a background check. With Thomas openly admitting his affair, he made no attempt to hide his infidelity, making gathering evidence straightforward. Furthermore, emboldened by his admission, he was captured toasting with his mistress. "To our 5th anniversary, cheers!" This meant Thomas had been having an affair for 5 years, even before our separation when our marriage wasn't yet in disarray. This meant I could claim compensation. Confronted with his lies exposed, Thomas began to tremble. His hands weakened, dropping the stack of papers on the desk. His eyes became vacant, his mouth moving as if searching for words. After 5 minutes, he managed to utter, "What should I do?" I leaned forward as if I had been waiting for those words. "I'll be claiming $30,000 from you as compensation for the affair and the emotional distress you've caused me. And from the other woman, $10,000. These amounts were the maximum claimable according to standard rates. Thomas panicked at the hefty sum. "I can't pay that. I mean, if I do, it will ruin my life." His excuses were expected. So, I presented an alternative. "Then let's settle it with compensation in the form of property division. But child support is a separate matter. You'll pay for all of Margaret's expenses, including her high school and future college fees." Faced with Thomas's refusal, I pressed on. "If you default, I'll go to court for enforcement. Your employer will be notified, and the amount will be deducted from your salary." Faced with this reality, Thomas reluctantly signed the documents my lawyer had prepared. This marked the end of our long battle. Afterwards, Thomas and I officially divorced, and the financial matters were settled through compensatory property division. Thomas had nearly no savings due to funding his mistress. So in the end, I was only able to protect the savings I had diligently amassed. Naturally, Thomas ended up with nothing from the divorce, a significant blow to him. Concerned about his employer finding out, he has been diligently paying child support every month. Margaret, as if to spite him, studied hard and got accepted into a prestigious private university. I can only imagine the look on Thomas's face when he received the bill for her tuition. His mistress, shortly after paying me the compensation, was arrested and convicted on charges of marriage fraud. It turns out she had other partners besides Thomas, promising marriage to each of them. Thomas really lacked judgment. Thomas, having lost his family, money, and mistress, and as well as his relationships with relatives and friends, would not have ventured into an affair if he had known it would lead to such despair. He lacked such foresight. Now, he leads a lonely life of just working and going home, paying child support every month. Apparently, his colleagues and neighbors knew about his situation, and he faces their cold stares, living in misery. Never underestimate the power of rural gossip network. Thomas learned this the hard way. Meanwhile, I returned home to support my dad, leading a peaceful life. One day, as my daughter was nearing her college graduation, she brought home a young man who seemed very pleasant. "He's my boyfriend." Dad, moved to tears at the prospect of Margaret's marriage, and I finally felt a sense of relief. Months later, as I helped Margaret with her veil on her wedding day, she said to me with tears in her eyes, "Mom, thank you for raising me. I promise I'll live a happy life." Attending my beloved daughter Margaret's wedding filled me with joy. Having parted ways with a terrible husband and seeing Margaret in her wedding dress was more than enough to fill my heart. I decided to cherish every minute and second for the rest of my life.